Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Beatles Forever. So today we're going to get back into our George Harrison adventure and join George into the 1980s and beyond. The videos I've done on George Harrison don't have to be watched in any order, and I've been reading the book George Harrison, The Reluctant Beatle, and that's how I found out things that I didn't know about George, and I thought that I would share what I learned with you. After the birth of Danny and the assassination of John, George Harrison started to get concerned about safety. George at this time bought a 63-acre plot in Maui. It was a remote area, built a house and a garden, and George had a love of the ukuleles, which he discovered from the performer George Formby. And so while George was there, he found the Rolls-Royce of ukuleles, the Kamaka, and he could play both the 6- and 8-string concert models. So George was obsessed with the ukuleles, and he would buy them out of the store and give them as gift to friends back in England. And next, George, he was in the filming business, and it was called Handmade, and they started with Shanghai Surprise. Madonna was a star in it, and her husband, Sean Penn. George got into filmmaking, and he created a business called Handmade Films. And the most famous movie they began was Shanghai Surprise. Madonna was the star in it, and her husband, Sean Penn. And this was the first time the company dealt with stars that were famous. Madonna had previously done Desperately Seeking Susan. Madonna wanted to broaden her range and be in a movie with her husband. George Harrison was to be the executive producer, and he was also writing and recording 5 songs for the soundtrack. And he had a cameo in the movie as a nightclub singer. They shot the film in Hong Kong, and there was chaos at the start of the film. Every time they were to do outside shooting, the paparazzi would be there. The director couldn't keep things under control. Sean Penn would fight the photographers, and the British film crew didn't like Madonna and Sean and called them the Poison Pins. So Dennis O'Brien, who was George Harrison's partner, was heading the company, and he asked George to go to Hong Kong to calm down everybody because of his Beatleness. So George felt like that he was being exploited, but he didn't know how much he was being exploited. And when they got to London, George called a press conference to get rid of some bad publicity. And Madonna didn't help matters by showing up an hour late. And Sean, he didn't show up at all. Well, George didn't like the role he was given, and he was uncomfortable with Madonna, too. Later, Madonna said he stopped her from answering questions, but he didn't have the right answers, and she said he kept saying the wrong things to try to calm people down, putting his foot in his mouth and in my mouth, too. Well, needless to say, the movie turned out to be a flop. Even though Sean and Madonna were married, they had no on-screen chemistry, and the songs that George had worked on were canceled. It wasn't a financial disaster, but to George it was a death sentence. He had given up chain smoking around this time, but having to deal with all the film's troubles, he started smoking again. His Hawaiian home wasn't that secluded. The garden that George had bought on his land was 33 feet from his house and had a path that was a public right-of-way, and it was the only access of the most popular fishing spot on the island. The people that used the path weren't that quiet. They were excited about being on vacation, and they would trample George's flowers and try to look through his bedroom window. He was afraid of a Mark Chapman-type person, and he had a childhood phobia about nosy neighbors. George decided to have the access blocked by a metal barrier with signs that said, "Keep out," and "No trespassing." Well, the neighbors were mad, and a legal battle began, which they had to take to court. And then George started to look for another place to go to. And Jackie Stewart, the race driver, suggested that Hamilton Island in Australia, and that was off central Queensland coast. George and Olivia didn't go to look at the place for a long time, so when they did, they liked what they saw. It was 1.9 miles, a single bungalow. It had a tropical garden, and George bought the 6-acre plot. It was on a bluff overlooking the ocean, and they wanted to start building on it. Around this time, George started working on Cloud 9. Jeff was to produce George's album, and when Jeff got there, Olivia told him that George was waiting for him by the lake. He was going to take him for a boat ride. And Jeff and George had a lot in common. Jeff was from a poor town in Birmingham, and he was a musician with ELO, and Jeff liked Formula One racing too. And he was also anxious for George to teach him the ukulele. When the album was released, it was said to be George's best album since All Things Must Pass. Then George and Jeff got into the Traveling Wilburys. They were looking for a song to go on the B-side of the record that George was making, and when they gathered as a group at the spur of the moment, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, George Harrison, and Jeff Lynne, they came up with the song Handle with Care. And when it was played to the co-producer of Cloud 9, he said it was a good song and it didn't deserve to be on a B-side. It was then the group decided to make an album together, the Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, and then, unfortunately, Roy Orbison died in 1988, and they continued as a quartet. And the Wilburys did another album called the Traveling Wilburys Volume 3 in 1990. And George thought they could continue to do albums together, and he wanted to do a film about the band, and it would be produced by his company, Handmade. But the group died out in 1991. I think that the members of the band wanted to go on tour and get the big money, but George wasn't interested in doing that touring again, so that's probably why the band dissolved. Well, then George has a problem with the Handmade Films company. He had created the business with his partner, Dennis O'Brien, in 1978 in order to help finance the Monty Python film Life of Brian. They met with an introduction by Peter Sellers, and their films were The Long Good Friday, Time Bandits. That movie was the most successful for the company, but things started to go downhill after a series of box office bombs in the late 1980s. There was a lot of debt that O'Brien created, and George didn't know about it. Dennis would take out a loan for Handmade at different times, and then George was the guaranteed one on the loan, but George thought he was co-signing with Dennis. George found out that he and Dennis weren't equal partners. Harrison was financing films on his own, while O'Brien collected money from the company. The accountant who uncovered what O'Brien was up to said that Harrison owed $25 million to creditors. The amount didn't bankrupt George, but it was a large amount of money, and if it hadn't been discovered, George would have gone bankrupt. But luckily for George at this time, the Beatles records were being put on CDs. Handmade Films ended in 1991, and it was sold 3 years later to Paragon Entertainment Corporation of Toronto, Canada. After that, George sued O'Brien for $25 million for fraud and negligence, but the settlement was only $11.5 million, and he had a hard time getting money from his partner. So now we'll find out more about George and Danny. When Danny was old enough to go to school, Danny was anxious to go to school to learn, which was unlike George. George was always asking Danny, "Do you want to go on a yacht to the South Pacific and run away forever?" But Danny, he liked school, so he went to the Ship Lake College, and he did well there, and he took science and technical subjects. And while George never did any school activities, Danny did every sport, even competitive rowing. And Danny got into the combat force that got students ready for a possible military career. George wasn't too happy seeing Danny dressed in a Royal Air Force uniform one day a week. And when Danny was younger, Ringo gave him his first set of drums. He was 6 years old. George started to teach him the guitar when he was 9, and he taught him to play the Buddy Holly song, Words of Love. Danny would spend time with George in the studio, and as much as Danny liked George's guitars, he also liked the race cars at the Grand Prix more. George had told Olivia one time that he hoped to be remembered as a gardener who had a few hit records on the side. Danny would tease George, and Danny was the only person who could tease him, and he called him Capability George, and that came from an 18th century garden designer named Capability Brown, who called the potential of any landscape in his charge capabilities. Danny would go on to Brown University in Rhode Island, and he studied in physics and industrial design, and he still loved race cars during that time. George, he loved the ukulele, and he followed the entertainer George Formby, who was a ukulele player in the 1940s. So there was and is a George Formby Appreciation Society, and they hold conventions, and there people would try to imitate George Formby's style. George Harrison joined the convention in the 90s and became a regular there, and he would compete with other Formby fans to sound like Formby, but George was outclassed by them. The society's president got a Formby gold-plated and engraved Ludwig banjole, and he spent years getting it into pristine condition. And it's the tradition of the society to give a fellow ukulele player their favorite instrument, and the society's president gave his to George. Well, needless to say, Harrison loved it, and he was like a kid at Christmas time. Monogamy wasn't easy for George. He thought of himself as a born-again Krishna, and that meant he could have his share of women. When George was home, he remained loyal to Olivia, but when he was traveling on the road, he played the old Beatles rule of sex on the road doesn't count. When he was in New York, he would visit clubs and carry 3 rubies in his pocket. If he saw a woman he liked, he would toss a ruby in front of her on a table or a bar. Olivia admitted that George did like women. She said he was pursued and he was a sensual person. Olivia said that during their marriage there was a lot of flirtation and there were a few bumps in the road. A friend of the couple said that she knew, Olivia that is, knew the name of every bump in the road and looked the other way. In time, George finally settled down and said he wanted a normal life. Olivia said that that is what she gave him. Now we go into George's health scares and other problems. When George was working in Friar Park, he noticed a lump in his neck, and it turned out to be cancerous. He got the lump removed and had 2 radiation treatments. He told reporters he got the lump from smoking. He had stopped smoking a few years ago, and he started up again with the Shanghai surprise stress. And then he stopped again once that was over. His Maui property he stayed away from for long periods of time, and one time a local broke into his house and got a frozen pizza from his refrigerator, cooked it, ate it, and then used George's washing machine to do her laundry. Things weren't that great as his Australian place either. The place was in a deserted area when he bought it, but now it was attracting tourists hoping to see him there. And Friar Park wasn't safe either. One time, thieves got into the garden and stole 2 bronze busts of friars. They were worth 50,000 pounds, and they got away without being caught. But the worst incident that happened on December 30th, 1999. An intruder broke through a fence, and that was where the cameras couldn't see him, and he made his way toward the house, and he stopped along the way to get a small stone statue. At this time, George and Olivia had just gone to bed. George was asleep right away, but Olivia was still awake, and she heard the sound of breaking glass. She woke George up when she realized someone was in there, and he put on a jacket over his pajamas and put on a pair of boots and started to look for the person. And at this time, Olivia called the police. So George went to the kitchen and smelled cigarette smoke and saw part of the statue on the floor, and the intruder had used it to break the glass on the patio door. So George shouted out to Olivia that someone was in there, and George was heading back to the bedroom when he saw a man in the great hall, and he was holding a stone sword from the statue in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other hand. The man screamed at George, "Get down here!" And George shouted the first thing that came to his mind, which was Hare Krishna. The man then ran up the stairs after George. George wanted to protect Olivia and her mother, and he tried to grab the knife. They got into a struggle and fell on the meditation cushions. George had the intruder on top of him, and he was stabbing George in his upper body. George had an outer body thought, thinking, "I'm being murdered in my own home." Olivia appeared and saw George looking confused and said he was very pale, and he also was staring at her in a bizarre manner. Olivia looked for a weapon and hit the intruder with a brass-handled poker. It didn't seem to faze the intruder, so she got a lamp and hit him with it. The Harrisons, they had a direct line to the Henley police station, and it only took them 12 minutes to get there. The housekeeper told him something happened at the house. He asked her if something had happened to his parents, and she didn't say anything. When Danny got there, police were there, and his mom was at the bottom of the staircase, and the poker was beside her. She had a bad head wound, and she told Danny, "Daddy's upstairs. He's badly hurt. Go." So Danny saw the intruder in the gallery. He was on the floor with 2 police officers standing over him. He looked at Danny for a long time. I bet he was confused with how much Danny looked like George. George was lying just inside the half-open bedroom door. He was bleeding from his stab wounds, and he had blood and air bubbling from the gashes in his chest. His lips and teeth were bloody, and there was blood on the walls and all over the floor. The paramedics hadn't gotten there yet, and Danny tried to stop the bleeding with paper tissues and towel, and it seemed hopeless. George was murmuring Hare Krishna and saying, "I'm going out." Danny supported his head and held his hand, and a policeman held the other hand. They tried to keep him conscious. Danny kept saying, "Dad, stay with me." And George nearly died 4 times before help came. But he would come back by hearing Danny's voice. So it turns out the guy who attacked George was a 34-year-old from Liverpool, and his name was Michael Abram. He was a paranoid schizophrenic, and he had been denied treatment from a psychiatric unit. They said he wasn't suffering from any mental illness. He was an obsessive Beatle fan, and for some reason he turned from worshiping them to feeling he would be doing God's will to kill a Beatle. George had 40 stab wounds. One had punctured his lung, and the other almost hit his heart. Olivia needed stitches for the gash in her forehead, and she was cut and bruised. So after all this, George received messages of sympathy from Paul, Ringo, and Tom Petty. For some reason, the attacker got sympathy too. from some of the people in Britain. There was a carload of people who drove up to Friar Park and passed by the fence and shouted their support for Michael Abram. He also got flowers from people while he was in the hospital. So this is crazy. I don't know why they would be siding with the guy that tried to kill George. And then Abram wrote a letter of apology to George and Olivia saying he didn't know he was schizophrenic, so he shouldn't be accountable for his crime. He said he thought his delusions were real. He thought he was experiencing some kind of witchcraft. Olivia and Danny went to the trial with heavy police and private security protection. George, he was weak from his wounds and traumatized by the experience, so he stayed home. The jury, after 2 days, decided Abram was not guilty by reason of insanity. He was ordered to be detained by the Scott Clinic indefinitely, so this was a secure psychiatric unit. Abrams was released in July 2022, and George had passed away by then. Abram, 3 years later, was training to become a volunteer advisor for the Citizens Advice Bureau. In March of 2001, George went to a checkup at the Mayo Clinic, and they discovered that George had cancer again, and it was in his lungs. They removed part of his one lung. One day, Patty got a call from George, and he said he was in the area visiting Ringo and Barbara, and he asked if he could stop by and see her. She said he was sweet and brought her flowers and little presents, and they walked in the fields behind the cottage. She said he looked fragile, and she knew that that would be the last time she would ever see him. During and after all this, George traveled a lot to find a cure. He went to Switzerland and found that the cancer had gone to his brain. George was still trying to get the $11 million from his one-time business partner at this time, too. And when George was in Switzerland, he started writing songs with Danny for the Brainwashed album, and he got a visit from Michael Palin. And he said that George spent the whole time playing Hoagie Carmichael songs and that they watched a documentary together about Hitler on TV. At this time, Ringo came by, and he said that George was very sick and could only lay down. And Ringo said he had to go visit his daughter in Boston. She was suffering from a brain tumor at this time. And George asked him if he wanted him to go with him. Then George, he traveled to New York for a new technique for treating brain tumors. George and his family stayed at a small rented house near the hospital. Paul McCartney came to see him. All the troubles they had were in the past, and they hugged each other and agreed that it was silly how they fought over guitar solos. And George's sister Louise came to see him. George at one time had given her a pension of $2,000, but broke off the contract when she turned the house where he stayed with her into a Beatle bed and breakfast. And they spent an hour and a half holding hands and reminiscing about their childhood. So George, he had to choose where he wanted to spend his final days. He wanted his privacy for his last days, and the places that he had wasn't going to give him that. Paul at that time had just got a house in Beverly Hills, and he said that George could stay there because the press didn't know anything about it. And his last days were in palliative care, and one of the last visitors was Eric Idle. In the hospital, George had asked the nurses to put fish and chips in his IV, and the doctor thought George was delusional and said to Danny, "Don't worry, we have a medical name for this condition." And Danny said, "Yes, humor." So this doctor evidently didn't have a sense of humor. George passed away November 29, 2001. Olivia and Danny were at his side, and he had his favorite Hare Krishna softly chanting. And then there was pictures of Krishna and Rama on the walls, and then they did some incense burning. Olivia said his passing was of profound beauty, and that the room seemed to light up as his soul left his body. George asked to be cremated immediately after his death. His wish was granted, and the paperwork was done, and he was sent to a Hindu temple for a simple ceremony. His ashes were given to Olivia, where she would take them to India and have the ashes scattered to the river Ganges. They held ceremonies in 2 different places, so no one knew where his ashes were scattered at. George did things his way till the end. It's a shame that George had to die so young. He loved the life he was living. He had the house of his dreams, his beautiful gardens and land. He loved the simple things in life, playing the ukulele and watching his favorite films. He finally settled down with Olivia, free from all the extramarital activities he had had done in the past. And he had a son that he enjoyed spending time with, as well as his friends. I'm glad we can enjoy George's legacy through films, books, and records, and that will keep his memory alive. I hope you enjoy the videos of George and a look into his life, which had us finding out about George and all his ways. And if you like the video, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. I wish everybody a good day, and tune in again soon for for another episode of The Beatles Forever. Thank you. Bye.